Hello, everyone, and welcome to French Like Moi with Scott, Dominic Carpenter, and Marcia DeSanctis. I am so excited to be here with you all. My name is Allison Carvalho, the events manager at Barbara's Bookstores, and I'm incredibly pumped about this event. Barbara's has been a Chicago institution since 1963, and we're incredibly excited to be bringing you this virtual event. We're a family-owned and operated bookstore, and we pride ourselves on creating community spaces within our stores as well as outside of them, like these events. Before we begin our discussion, I want to give you a quick tour of Crowdcast for those of you who haven't been here before. Firstly, we are still new to these virtual events, believe it or not. We've been doing them since June, but we're still figuring things out. So please be patient with us in case we have any technical issues. If things end up going sideways, just bear with us. We're going to get things back up and running as fast as we can. Please feel free to use the chat function on the side with fellow book lovers. We'll be providing links with more information about our upcoming events, as well as information about these books. If you happen to notice that your video is freezing or lagging, use the little tiny gear button near the video, and then you'll be able to adjust your HD setting to 360. That tends to help with any lag you might experience. The last 10 to 15 minutes of the event will be open for questions. So if you have a question for these authors, please use the Ask a Question function that is at the bottom of the screen. All you have to do is just click on it, type in a question, and then it'll be uploaded. And then other people can vote on your question, and any questions that get upvoted will move up in the queue to be asked faster. So I definitely recommend to make sure to keep an eye on that Ask a Question function to see what other book lovers are putting in there. Very importantly, please make sure to check out on the bottom of the screen. You should see a button that says to purchase these books. You can get them right here. It's this wonderful green button. Just click on that and it'll take you to where you can purchase the books on our website. Lastly, I want to make sure that we are being as respectful as possible in the chat and throughout the event. These events are designed to be a fun, informative space, and we definitely want to keep it that way. All right, I think that's everything. I am incredibly excited to bring these authors to the screen. Our first author is Minnesota-born and Midwest-bred Scott Dominic Carpenter. He's the author of The Theory of Remainders, a novel, and This Jealous Earth stories. Winner of a Mark Twain House Royal Nonsuch Prize for Humor, recipient of a Minnesota State Arts Board grant, and a semifinalist for the Many Voices Project Prize. He's published work in a wide variety of venues, including The Rumpus, Silk Road, Catapult, South Dakota Review, and various anthologies. Scott will be interviewed by the former television news producer and New York Times bestselling author, Marcia DeSanctis. She is the author of 100 Places in France Every Woman Should Go and contributes to Vogue, Town and Country, Departures, Travel and Leisure, and many other publications. She's also the recipient of 5 Lowell Thomas Awards for Excellence in Travel Journalism. I'm excited to bring to the screen Scott Dominic Carpenter and Marcia DeSanctis. Welcome.
Hi, all.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Allison. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Barbara's Bookstores. These are all these bookstores around Chicago and one in Boston. I'm sure they're the heartbeat of their town, wherever they are. And everybody from all over the place, St. Louis, the West Coast. I'm also in Connecticut, where we're having a heat wave, which is one of my favorite French words. You can say it, right? Canicule, right? It's one of my favorite French words. And I'm really excited to talk about your book tonight. It's a fantastic book. It's very entertaining and very funny and very smart. And it's getting great reviews all over the place and seems to be selling very well as well. And it's really nice for everybody, I think, to take a break and take a little respite from all the things that we're kind of going through as a people and as a country and as a planet, actually, and just relax into something really, really wonderful about everybody's favorite subject, which is France. So to start out, why don't you just read a little passage from the beginning and set up the book for us and the story, the journey as it is.
Yeah, so happy to do so. And you're right. I mean, I think this is a great time for people to get outside of these apartments and homes that we've been sequestered in for so long. We can't do it in real ways, but we can do it in some virtual ways. So it's possible to do a little bit of travel in France. And so I thought what I would do is just read the very beginning, that which gives a sense of what the book is about. And it starts with the this great adventure that my wife and my family undertook of buying an apartment in Paris. So the opening is called Murders in the Rue Bobillot. To be honest, Madame C replied in French, the problem is the neighbors. They refuse to die. The comment sent my tea gurgling down the wrong pipe. While I hacked and wheezed, our hostess pinched her brow with concern. Her sandy-haired partner, Patricia, tendered a napkin in case my insides came out. Ça va, Monsieur Carpenter? Ça va, I croaked, flapping my hand to keep her at bay. Repeating it seemed a good idea. Ça va, ça va. Anne, who'd been off inspecting the kitchen, returned to the living room for the chore of pounding her husband on the back. Madame C watched from the sofa, and Patricia added cubes of sugar to their tea. The mood was far from homicidal. This kind of situation occurred with distressing frequency in Paris. I'd start a conversation on one topic, only to find it veering into another. When I squinted at the butcher's explanation about cutlets, the road would somehow fork off to plumbing. At the post office, I'd be learning about airmail options, only to feel the clerk had hairpinned to the subject of Etruscan pottery. Swerves like this generally meant I'd misunderstood some crucial word, had careened off the conversational cliff, and had gone airborne for an undetermined amount of time. So when Madame C mentioned murder as the reason for selling her apartment, I recognized the floating sensation and braced for impact. Where, I wondered during the fall, had I gone wrong? After all, the verb mourir had definitely whizzed by, calling to mind the deathiness of mortgages and mortuaries. And I was pretty sure she'd said something about neighbors. Of course, there had been a slew of other words too, some of them possibly significant. It's always hard to tell which parts of a foreign language are the engines and axles, and which are the hood ornaments and air fresheners. Sometimes, if you play along, you can avoid a crash landing. So why do you suppose that is, I said. I mean, why is it the neighbors won't? And here I made a rolling gesture with my hand, inviting Madame C to fill in the gap with a clarifying comment. She shrugged. It was inexplicable. Monsieur and Madame Potard were old and infirm, but they simply refused. You mean they refused to... My hand swirled. They refused to partir, she said. That is, to leave. Like to an old folks' home? No. Her look went steely. To the grave.
I love what you do with language in this book, and deathiness. I mean, it's a great word. You're kind of inventing words as you go along, which is great. So obviously you do get this apartment. Nobody dies.
True.
And then walk us through a little bit about kind of where this is in Paris, and kind of how much time elapses from the beginning and the end of the memoir. Like this is an experience of a year. This is 6 months. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll start with the second part first, right? So the book starts with the buying of this apartment, and it really starts with a kind of a sabbatical year that I had, and so we got settled in there. But then the stories keep going. So even after that first year, over the next few years, various things happen to me. I seem to attract a certain number of catastrophes, and so there was additional material. So from start to finish, it's probably a 4 or 5 year period. Which allows me to also include some more contemporary topics, especially later in the book. You were asking about where this is located, and so I wish I could say that this was some sort of like noble grand gesture on my part, that I thought I should really move into the working class neighborhoods and it'll be good for my soul. It was actually good for my pocketbook. That we started looking for an apartment in sort of the traditional center of Paris. And it was just so very expensive that we had to look a little further out and a little further out and a little further out. And we ended up sort of toward the end of the 13th arrondissement in Paris, which is not the place that anybody goes for tourist reasons. And I have to say, it was the best turn of events I could ever have hoped for. It's now my favorite part of Paris, and it is entirely devoid of tourist attractions. So there's no Louvre, there's no Notre Dame, there's no Musée d'Orsay or anything like that. It's filled with people living, doing things in Paris, and quite a rich mix of people. So it's a wonderful area.
So would you say this is the real Paris, or is the Paris that we know from the brochures and from the perfume ads and and all the other things, the champagne commercials? Is that the real Paris? Or
yeah, so everybody thinks they have their own bead on the real Paris. Of course, my Paris is the real Paris, but I think actually the experiences that I relate in the book and the whole sort of goal of the book itself is to undo some of the glitzy, shiny, brilliant Paris that we get in tourist brochures and that we see in movies. Paris is that city that is that everybody knows before they go there. It's actually, I think, the hardest city in the world to write about because everybody thinks they know it, even if they have never been there. Because they
think they're going to see Audrey Hepburn twirling around in front of the Eiffel Tower or something, right?
That's right. Or there are things like the Amélie Poulain tours that you can do. So you can go through Montmartre and you can sort of relive Amélie's life step by step. Well, maybe that's not the real Paris that people are living, just as when you see films about that take place in New York, it's not often the real New York that we're getting. So the goal was to try to kind of peel some of that back and see what real life is like and what kinds of small everyday struggles are going on. And in my particular case, there were lots of them, lots of struggles.
Well, it is interesting that obviously the center of Paris is full of tourists, people from all different countries, and in the place where you lived and even where I lived when I lived in the 20th arrondissement of Paris, and our bakery, our boulanger, our bakery worker lived upstairs from us. And of course she got up at 2 or 3 in the morning every day and put on her high heels. But it's interesting because a lot of these are the places where the workers are and the people, and obviously many of them turn into significant characters in your book, which is interesting.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, in the center of Paris, the center of Paris is also a very rich mix, but it's especially a rich mix because of tourists, right? So Paris is the most heavily visited city in the world. And there's a different kind of a richness when you get into the outer arrondissements because there are immigrant populations. It's just like this kind of influx of people from various places, also people coming up from the provinces, and they're there to settle in and contribute what they have to contribute and to interact in the different ways that they have to interact. And it just makes for a really rich mixture.
Yeah, so rich in 2 ways. The center of Paris is rich and rich kind of financially, and the places, the more neighbory neighborhoods are rich kind of more maybe in personality. So the book is really it's a kind of a compilation of all these characters that you gathered, but you turned each of them into each of these characters built around an essay. How did you figure out that structure? That you're it's kind of a memoir in essays, I would say. I'd call it that. Yeah. They're all linked together. There's a through line, but how did you think of that structure? Because it's really more about other people than it is about you. You're sort of the narrator, the observer watching the whole thing, but it's a very interesting and very entertaining structure. How did you figure that out?
Well, I'm glad to hear that it's entertaining. That's a good start. I would say, part of this just has to do with the way that I think of travel, that I think travel is, for me, the most important thing about travel is encounters with other people. I'm as interested, I guess, as the next person at seeing some tremendous architecture and going to a museum and taking in a show, an exhibit or something at the museum. But really what I want is interaction. So my experiences always, the most important ones, the ones that I find to be formative, have to do with encounters with people. Sometimes they're surprise encounters. Sometimes they're very fleeting encounters, right? It might be a single interaction with somebody and I never ever see them again. But as you know from the book, there are also certain characters who recur. So people that I come in contact with regularly, friends that I have, so developed many friendships over the years. So these people also become the characters that that populate this little world. And sometimes you're right. Sometimes there's like a central character that the story seems to be built around in some way. An example of that, I guess, would be the essay called "The Metamorphosis," which has to do with so it's the medical metamorphosis. It's built around my encounters with my doctor, my physician, a man I revere, tremendously, charming fellow. Despite the fact that medicine is practiced, especially sort of general practitioner medicine is practiced in a very different way in France. So that just evolves naturally. My back went out. I had to go to the doctor. I'd been seeing this guy for a long time, and it turns into an anecdote. Some of the other ones are like maybe a little less structured specifically around a particular character, but I would say there's no story for me without these characters. Me being inside of a city without people doesn't really lend itself to, that does not a good story make. So I'm always looking for ways to connect with the people.
So another question that might be a little more about process, but it's also about the book, which is we're all, so many of us readers are fascinated by memoir. But did you ever feel like you were living your life for the memoir, or were you just keeping notes and seeing how the pieces kind of shook out when you were done? And did you sort of want things to happen that that weren't perfect, or so you'd have a better story? I mean, did that happen at all?
Right. So I never went to the like stage of pushing somebody in front of a bus so that I could write about it. Right. I didn't do that.
Or being pushed in front of a bus. But,
or stepping in front of a bus, right? I could, another opportunity to write about the medical system, throw myself in front of a bus. It's a little bit of a mix, I think, for me. So I had no plans early on to turn this into a book. I mean, mostly I was just like living these experiences. And I think a lot of it went back to what I consider to be the kind of origin story for the book, which was some years ago when I was leading a tour. I've been sort of hired as to accompany a group of Americans who were on a 2-week tour in southern France. I had no real responsibilities. There was a real tour guide, and I was just there to sort of be this presence. And it was a part of the country I knew really well. Every day we'd be, going off to castles and visiting prehistoric sites and stopping in little tiny villages. And the trip was organized down to the last detail. So they'd be the guides would be whispering to the people at the restaurant, saying, "Okay, now is the time to wow them with the Armagnac that they've never had before." We'd be on the bus, and they'd say, "Okay, slow down at the next curve because that's where we'll stop and take a picture of the valley." And it just felt so sort of staged. And on the second to last day, we were at a farm, and because they wanted to show us how geese get fatted for making foie gras. And you know how that's done. They put a funnel in the beak and they start like funneling in all this grain, shoveling it down, force feeding them. And that's when it occurred to me that that's what had been happening for the past 2 weeks. They'd put a funnel into our brain and they were shoveling in all these cliches. And that very same day, we went back to the hotel and everybody was trotting off the bus and going upstairs to put away their goose paraphernalia and their postcards. And suddenly cries rang out in the corridors of the hotel. And it turned out that while we were out, the place had been burgled. And the wall safes had been ripped out of the walls. People had lost their money and their passports. It was hue and cry and mayhem, and the hotel owner was wringing his hands, and the gendarme came tumbling out of their little car and running around. And it was great. It was the first time that reality had erupted in our little 2-week stay. And I thought, yes, this is what happens when there are catastrophes or sudden events like this that help to crack through that highly polished surface of French life, and maybe especially Parisian life. That's what makes for a good story. So I just started noting these things down. And it's true that occasionally, as I was really involved in the project, there were a couple of times when there were opportunities that came up where I thought this would actually make a good story. And that became a kind of incentive to pursue it.
Yeah, so you got your inspiration. Everybody went home with a good story.
Yeah, that's right.
Everybody went because everybody sees pictures of the perfect trip, and
Right.
everybody's bored. But what you really want to say is this bad thing happened to us. So were there any cliches about France or that you were particularly eager to kind of crush? Or about I can't even say about the French, because this is really about Paris, which is a particular slice of France.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think what I really wanted to puncture was this the sense of kind of romantic Paris. Right. There's this exoticizing of Paris that happens all of the time, and it's the city is portrayed in this feminine way all of the time, even by the tourist bureau. The way that logos are done, the city is really feminized, and it turns into this. It's sort of sensualized and eroticized, and in fact, it's not that. I mean, it goes to the all the romantic evenings that people spend eating really horrible dinners on bateau mouche, cruising up and down the Seine, and things like that. So it plays into this notion of romance. But really, it's a city with its grittiness, with its fineness, with its angles and its curves. And so I was really trying to pull away from some of that.
Yeah, someone said it's romance or faux-mance.
Yeah,
or something in Paris. But speaking of cliches, one of the things you do very well, as I said, is you can kind of take a very sharp wit and pen to some of these cliches. And one of them is, we'll read the story about when you were walking around in the evening and you were just having this super Parisian moment, like practically dancing down the street. I'm in Paris. And read a little bit about that and tell us what happened there.
Yeah, so a great example, because everybody is sort of the dupe of these cliches. Me too, right? I too succumb to this all of the time. It's just so ingrained. But so this is after we'd been living there for a couple of months and kind of getting used to things. And it goes like this. Repetition forged relationships. The newspaper vendor knew what to ring before I made it through the door. The bakery lady and I played a little game each day where she'd ask what I wanted as she reached for the object of my desire. The barber checked to make sure I wanted the same cut as last time. Even old Monsieur Potard, his unblinking eyes magnified by the glasses, sometimes uttered a greeting in the hallway. I'd finally broken through the social crust. The neighborhood was turning into my neighborhood. You could hear it in the way people greeted me. No dictionary can capture the endless permutations to which the word bonjour is subject. Now clipped and cold, now playful and filled with song, these two syllables can tell whole novels, the vowels alone containing 1,000 shades of meaning. I was getting the whole symphony. Yes, Paris changes. The proof was that the neighborhood had absorbed me. I celebrated this victory one day with a long stroll across my territory, all the way through Chinatown, coming out close to the Ring Road, where I stopped in a cafe for a beer. It was twilight when I headed home, one of those cloudless evenings when the breeze is hot but dry. The sky had gone purple, a few of the bolder stars already glinting. The universe stretched overhead, heavenly bodies bound by invisible strands, like the woof and weave that envelop us all. It was one of those moments when you feel you're part of a vast communion of souls. I passed a young woman on the street, and out of nowhere she uttered bonsoir. Not the impersonal shopkeeper version, but something more fragrant and familiar. We're all in this together, her tone said. We are human beings on a common adventure. I walked now with a lighter step. Sometimes the heavens aligned. Things could fit. Two people crossing paths on a sidewalk in a huge city could sense their shared humanity. the fleeting pleasure of intersecting lives. Bonsoir, another woman called from the darkness. It was catching. I glanced back and we exchanged a smile. Bonsoir, I sang, infusing the word with emotion. You are fresh and beautiful, my greeting communicated. In another life, who knows what might have been? The moment was ripe with possibility, and its passing would remain with both of us forever. Bonsoir, a third voice rang out as I danced ahead. This girl was heavier. She wore a leather skirt, and her fishnet stockings led to stiletto heels. Then I understood, and my shoulders rounded. As night fell, the prostitutes had slunk out like cats.
Are you able to hear me again?
I
Good.
am able to hear you. Are you able to hear me?
All right. I am able to hear you now. Sorry, we're having a little issue, but it's on my end.
Okay.
It's so interesting how you do that, but in a way, you sort of embodied what we do all love about Paris, which is the light and the feeling.
Yeah.
It's that sort of that vague, that vague thing that you can really only experience if you've been there, and something kind of happens to you when you go to Paris in a way. Is there anything that really surprised you about living in Paris? I mean, obviously your book is full of surprises in a way to you personally and experiences that were new, but anything very, very surprising?
I guess I would start by saying that I think Paris is a city built around the whole notion of surprise. It is, when it was being imagined and renovated and redone in the 19th century, when all the big boulevards were being put in, there was this very deliberate idea that people should turn a corner and just be wowed by what they saw. So this had to do with, why they plopped the opera house down at the end of the Avenue de l'Opéra. And so many structures are set there as these, to create a kind of a vista. And I think that happens in small ways too, right? You turn the corner and suddenly there's a group of men sitting on a bench, drinking beers and whistling at women. It's like, whoa, I wasn't expecting that. You walk into the bakery and suddenly you have this utterly charming encounter with the woman trying to sell you a croissant. So every time you take a turn, there's something surprising going on. I've got this short piece in the book about the simple act of trying to exchange a light bulb. So I buy a light bulb and it's the wrong one and I have to take it back for an exchange. The simplest of all possible things, and it turns into a drama. And I have to say, that's the kind of thing that I just love about Paris. I find it terrifically frustrating in the U.S. where I can't get anything done or whatever. But in France, it turns into this kind of adventure.
And why is that? Because I wonder why that is. I guess it's because we're all your senses are on or something in Paris. It's like all you're engaged with all five senses at all times or something.
Yeah, I think that's right. And maybe even a sixth sense or something. There's also the sense that the Paris that you're going through is the Paris that has been walked through by millions of other people over the course of hundreds of years. So you're sensitized to what's going on now. You're also susceptible to all of the things that have happened in the past. I think about, you've got your great book about the 100 places a woman should go in France and in France, and you write about the Palais Royal, and saying relatively little about the Palais Royal as it is now, but the way that it's steeped in all of these figures from the past, and the lasting sites like the Véfour restaurant and Colette's ghost that sort of haunts this. So I think that also adds to the mystique of being in Paris.
Yeah, and also being somebody who knows Paris gives you a little mystique too. I feel, do people, you kind of live the dream, what everybody dreams of doing, move to Paris. And do you think that people love and hate you for that a little bit?
It's crazy. I I often run programs for students. So the college that I teach at has a program in Paris, and I'm often the director of the program. And I have colleagues who say, "Oh, you're so lucky. You get to go and spend a term in Paris." And meanwhile, I'm in Paris, like working my tail off, and things are falling apart faster than I can put them back together. And so it's I'm living what other people think is the dream. But for me, it's just like this kind of white knuckle ride most of the time, trying to stay on top of things. I have to say, man, I love it. I love that kind of white knuckle ride, but it's certainly not the slow and elegant and graceful Parisian experience that people often dream of.
Sometimes when I was reading this book and then reading it again, I think about how sharp your observation powers are and kind of how acute they are to idiosyncrasies. And yet you're an academic, you teach French and you teach French literature. Can you tell me, is this something that you work on, or is this something that are you aware that you do it well? Or, do you know when you're looking at behavior or at patterns that you're recognizing them?
Wow, that's an incredibly hard question. I don't know. So there's the academic background, and I would say the academic background adds a little bit to this. I think there are things that I've learned about Paris and France in general that I've learned in a sense academically, but I think it's more that because of my academic job, it has thrust me into these experiences of that are not academic experiences, that are just the experience of living. And it may be that the academic work has given me the stick-to-itiveness or something to note things down, to try to be observant. And so I think I spent a lot of years doing like literary analysis. And so it really does require a certain degree of like sensitivity to things. And I think that kind of cultural analysis, which is in a sense what's going on in this book, a kind of cultural analysis. It's not analytical, but it requires the same kind of sensitivity that one has to read a culture and read a relationship and read a situation the way that one would read a book or a poem. So I think there's a little something there. But otherwise, if I'm maybe it's practice. Maybe I've done it a lot, so you get a little bit better at it.
Yeah, you must be very fun to travel with. But there is a lot of sociology in here. And for example, sometimes there's a very fine line between being super annoyed by somebody's quirk and also fascinated and kind of full of tenderness. And an example of this is you talk in a couple of places about French people's kind of attention to detail. And there's something about this woman who is your cheese vendor,
right?
Which is sort of another cliche about France, but another cliche that you've turned on its ear with these kind of powers of really getting inside this woman and what is making her her job enjoyable and possible. So could you read that about your friendly neighborhood cheesemonger?
Yeah, happy to. So, and I will say that, turning the cliche on its ear, of course, there's also some truth to cliches. So it's as if like one ear stays with the cliche, the other ear gets turned upside down or something. So this is from the essay called Squirrel Pie and the Golden Derriere. At the cheese shop the other day, a woman with a strong chin and dark curls labored over my order. First, she cut a strip of potent Comté with a double-handled scimitar better suited to removing a king's head. Next came the crumbly Roquefort, which she sliced with a wire garrote. All her tools seemed designed for more sinister purposes. When she turned and asked me what else I'd like, I reviewed the landscape of wheels and pyramids. My gaze fell upon something new, a stippled little hockey puck of beige. Qu'est-ce que c'est? I asked. When her eyes lit up, I realized my blunder. Alas, too late. Well, she said, sucking in a breath, for starters, it's cow's milk. That was the last thing I fully understood before the hail of information. It was a pressed cheese, she explained, rather than a cooked one, produced deep in the Alps, beyond Grenoble, near the Chartreuse Monastery, where the liqueur used to be distilled. She took another gulp of air and plunged back in, telling me how much fat the cheese had, in what conditions it had been aged, how the molds formed on the crust, which way the mountainside faced, how much the cows ate for breakfast, and what their names were. I'll take one, I said, hoping to close the breach before the tide of details reached my chin. In France, she went on, her dimples deepening with excitement, we eat it with a bit of jam. And then she was suggesting flavors, launching into the technology of fruit preservation. Okay, I said, 2. In France, she harped, you can make a whole meal out of it. It was time for the ejection button. I patted my pocket in mock surprise and pulled out my phone, pressing it to my ear. What? Then I forced my eyebrows up and spaced out my words. Oh my God, I'll be right there. I looked at the cheese lady and pointed accusingly at the phone, giving the universal gesture for, it's not my fault. Her shoulders rounded, but she conceded to ring me up. I'm not proud of lies like this, but sometimes that's the price of self-preservation.
So it's great how you understand her so well, and you understand where she's going, because there are other people in your life that your friend, Sabine's husband, is also a real detailologist, right? He just knows everything about everything.
Yeah.
Why do you think that? Why do you think that is such a? Why do you think Americans are different in that respect?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a sort of a chicken and egg question, right? I mean, I think it's largely because of the educational system. But then the question is, why is the educational system like that? Maybe it corresponds to the way that we already are. But there is this way in which the French educational system plays into this infatuation with knowledge, and it really reveres the idea that people should know something. And in the US, we've kind of outsourced that to Google, right? I mean, how many times do you sit around at the dinner table and somebody says, well, I wonder what that is. I have no idea. Let's Google it. We're in France, people sometimes occasionally still know things. And it's built into the kind of rote learning that they encourage in the schools, which is sometimes sort of tedious, and it might be a little bit tiresome sometimes, but it also means that they have some things at their fingertips, which I think is really quite lovely. And it means that the French in general, right, so we already move into generalizations, if not cliches, but in general, the French do have a greater tolerance for, maybe admiration for, the accumulation of knowledge in particular areas, and people often have special areas where they read up on various things, and they like to have this. Whereas Americans tend to like the big picture, the slightly sloppier gist of things. And in the book, in one part, I compare it to the difference between those paintings by Seurat, those little pointillist paintings where all these little dots compose a picture, and Monet, these watery things where you can just sort of barely tell what's going on, but you get the general impression. And Americans like Monet, and the French like Seurat.
That's funny. That's funny. And yet you had all this knowledge about France, so you probably could have gone head to head with people if you even wanted to. Let's say the discussion was about literature or history or something, and you spoke the language perfectly, and that must have also surprised people a little bit.
Yeah, so that was a little useful to be able to, if you needed to, like throw people off their own game just a touch. But there are also, a couple of stories where I try to go head to head with somebody and I can't quite pull it off. I end up making some things up, and maybe not the most noble way of working your way through these conversations. But so right, as an American who spent a long time in France, I can sort of play that game a bit. And actually, it's a little bit like speaking the language. You also have to speak the culture. So you do learn that over time. I'm sure you found the same thing to be true.
I did find it to be true. And I think for me, it was always, no matter how good my French was, no matter how Parisian my clothes were, no matter how latest was my handbag, there's something about the walk and the carriage.
Yeah.
and I could never escape it. I'd say, how, come on, you don't have to speak back to me in English.
Right.
And did you find that too? That you just, no matter what you do, you could have a cigarette and a beret and
Yeah,
frank as could be.
it depends. The title essay that's called French Like Moi, right in the middle of the collection, talks a little bit about that, about ways in which one either sort of merges with the surrounding Frenchness or does not. The way you sometimes make a gesture that goes a little bit too far in the playing of Frenchness, and the ways you can sometimes get called out for it. Yeah, I don't want to spill sort of the beans on that particular story, but it shows the kinds of disasters that it can lead to. Yeah.
Well, you've said that just your kind of Germanic,
yeah,
your Germanic presence, maybe, or it's your body or your coloring, but still they could think you were German, but they know you're American. It's just this sixth sense that the Parisians have, I think.
But you mentioned, the walk and the way one holds the body. These are so most communication is not verbal, right? Most communication has to do with intonation and gesture and positioning of the body and things like that. So one of the things that students often find distressing when I have students in Paris, so a couple of things. I mean, they'll often think that their host family, they'll come back to class the first day after they've had a night with their host family. They'll say, I need to be moved from my family because I think they're getting a divorce. It's like, what happened? At the dinner table, they were arguing all through the dinner. It's like, no. They were not arguing. They were discussing. That's what happens, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of thing can throw people off, and so it's also the kind of space that one has between one's interlocutor. So in America, right, America has a lot of space, and they like to keep that space, keep the other person at bay a little bit. Whereas in France, you have these conversations, and they're not especially intimate conversations, but you're only 14 inches away from the other person, and it's somehow perfectly normal. And there are little things like that end up kind of revealing where one is culturally, right? Or what one is comfortable with.
So I'm going to ask you one last thing before we take a few questions. Don't forget to ask questions, and don't forget to click to buy and buy a couple copies, because it's a great thing to give people. I think you'll really enjoy it. Obviously, a big tradition of Midwesterners in Paris and in France, and is there something particular about how a Midwestern person, a person from the Midwest of the United States experiences Paris?
I think the Midwest also suffers from an abundance of cliches. It's sort of Garrison Keillor land. It's Lake Wobegon. It's the very uptight Norwegian presence and things like that. So to that extent, these are two places that have very different cliches, right? In terms of cliches, they are utterly opposite. The sort of plain spoken, if spoken at all, right? It might be like very taciturn, short phrased Midwesterner, with Paris and all of its cosmopolitanism and elegance and chic and all of that. So these things, it's a little bit of an oil and water mixture. But of course, because these are cliches, I think that's what makes it interesting. Because they're cliches, one encounters this mix of these opposites, expecting that that there will be a massive collision and that sparks will fly. Well, some sparks fly, but actually underneath it all, there's quite a bit that joins people across all sorts of cultural divides. So it's a kind of a peeling away, I think, of cliches on both sides. There's some ways in which I think the book is almost as much about the Midwest as it is about Paris. And that would be the hope, that it would open up a little bit on both of those sides.
Well, there's always been such a draw from the Midwest. I remember here, I think Hemingway's first 3 wives were all from St. Louis, and they all kind of ended up in Paris, which is so interesting. interesting. There's a draw. It's kind of a little bit as far away as you can get, but you can, but whoever yourself is kind of appreciated. It was different for me because I'm from Boston, so we have a different kind of superiority complex, maybe, or we're just sophisticated, even though we're not New Yorkers. So it's interesting. All right, so we have some really good questions. I'd love to have a few more, though, if anyone would like to ask one. This is a good question. What was your proficiency in French before you moved to Paris? Obviously pretty darn good, right?
Yeah, it was. I'd been taking French ever since childhood and had been forced into French classes. It was something my parents somehow, for some bizarre reason, felt was important. It was not at all important to me, but I was nudged along in that direction. So I'd had familiarity with French and some with France, and of course, even before moving there, I'd spent time working there and renting places. I will say that what I did not have was this other deeper language. So proficiency in French language, yes, but not so much in these hidden nooks and crannies of French culture. And being there, having these very deep connections with other people, that kind of thing really afforded me the opportunity to deepen this other kind of cultural grammar or cultural syntax or something that I really did need to develop. But language wasn't so much of a problem.
Yeah, which helps, but I think it has changed a lot. It's a much more Anglophone country than it used to be. It's very surprising to me every time I go back that people really, really used to, the sort of the image used to be of the kind of gruff Parisian woman pretending she didn't understand you when you were ordering your palmier at the boulangerie, but now they seem to really want to speak English.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think they have internationalized. I will say that French language teaching in the schools is typically not very good. That the French already have a kind of an obsession with their own language, right? France is this country that developed, these massive dictionary projects, and they have the Académie française, and so there is a great burden of responsibility already on the French just to somehow master their language or allow themselves to be mastered by their language, and to navigate all of that, which makes them a little hyper sensitive about speaking a foreign language. So they're already very worried that they'll make mistakes in French. And if you're too afraid of making mistakes, then you never learn a foreign language. But over the years, I think you're right. That has eased up quite a bit. And there are people who are getting a lot of regular exposure and traveling abroad, living abroad. And so that makes it much easier for people going to Paris for the first time, especially if they don't have the language.
Mm-hmm. Another question, this one is from Tom Hancock. Have you read David Leibovitz's book, La Part, about buying an apartment life in Paris? Very funny book.
Yeah, right. That's a great book. So there's a little bit of overlap between La Part and mine, to the extent that so I have a chapter that is dedicated to remodeling. His whole book is principally dedicated to getting sort of installed and remodeled. So that's actually another really good title that I would recommend for people who want to see what life is like behind the scenes.
Yeah, because of course La Part means it's short for like apartment.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Any other questions here? Well, tell us a few more stories then about the book. Is there any part of this book that was, let's say, difficult to write? Or even difficult either emotionally or difficult as far as getting the pieces to fall together?
Yeah, I mean, so there were a couple of chapters that were difficult to write, and for different reasons. I would say the chapter that was the hardest to write, and maybe for obvious reasons, is the chapter that deals with terrorism in France, so especially around Paris. And so I was there the year of Charlie Hebdo and the Bataclan attacks, and there were other attacks that went on. It was not a good year, in a sense, for Paris in that respect. And it's, of course, French Like Moi is principally a humorous book, and that is not a subject that lends itself to humor. But it's also, I think, a kind of a revelatory thing, the way that people responded to it, and it tells a lot about the culture, the kind of solidarity that people experienced. So it felt important to also include that. And so finding the right tools for telling that story in the context of a book that is mostly has another tone going through it. That was difficult. I really, I sort of enjoyed that challenge, but it was a difficult one to do.
And so can you tell a little bit about how you experienced those events? Were you?
Yeah. So, for example, the attacks on the Bataclan in November of 15, I was in my apartment, and
that was the nightclub. It was a place where an American band
it was sort
playing.
of a small concert hall, with a bar in the back, and so there had been a number of attacks. There were a number of attacks that night in cafes in that area near the Bastille on the right bank. And there had also been an attempted attack at the big stadium, the Stade de France. And I was in my apartment, and I, like many people, I heard about this, and I had the news on. I was like watching in real time what was going on, and I was a few miles away from all of this. But you'd open your window, and everybody was opening up their windows and leaning out and seeing, could they hear, gunfire? Could they hear sirens? What was going on? And but because it wasn't like in our neighborhood, it all seemed very abstract at first. But then almost right away, the text messages started flying, and people were checking to find out, are you okay? Is everybody okay? And so everybody was checking on the safety of their friends and loved ones. And it turned out that a friend of a friend was killed in the attack on the Bataclan, died in that attack, which that brings it home, right? That really rivets it. It's no longer something that's just on the screen or something on the other side of town. It really touches one. So I was putting that in the context of what it was like to deal with difficult experiences like that. So how it is that one talks about these things, and was also talking to students about this. So I was working with students at the time, and so it's a very sort of process-oriented piece. I think talking about how one talks about such difficult topics.
And that really was really almost society-changing series of events in France, for sure.
Right.
So if there are no more questions.
Well, I see a couple of questions in the ask a question thing. We could maybe tick off a couple.
I'm not seeing that. Okay. There you go. David Leibovitz. All right. All right. What was your cooking food experience? It doesn't say, what was your cooking food experience like? Did you drastically change your diet once you moved there?
I think everybody changes their cooking when they're there, partly because it's unavoidable, right? There are certain like Americanized things that you can't find. Good luck, if you like to live off of mac and cheese, Kraft mac and cheese, you're going to have a hard time finding it. But it's also that there are just so many new and different things that are on offer. I would say the most splendid thing, especially coming from the Midwest, the most splendid thing in Paris is to go, and terrifying thing is to go to a fishmonger, right? These giant displays of all these incredible marine animals that evidently can be eaten, even though they look as though they might eat you. And so I was like, how is it one manages this? And then you have to get the advice of the people. So that's the great thing, is you stop at these little shops and you go to the butcher, you go to the fishmonger, and you say, well, what do I do with this? They say, well, do I have a recipe for you? And then they kind of coach you through it. So yeah, I found myself sort of blending cuisines a little bit. I do have a piece in the book about trying to make a kind of a special version of coq au vin, chicken and wine sauce, for some friends. So cooking is always an adventure in these places.
How did that work out for you? How did the coq au vin, how did your Minnesota coq au vin work out for you?
Yeah, well, let's just say that it was not universally revered.
Yeah, but it sounded delicious.
Yeah.
The number one question here that has the most votes is, I've read that the 13th has many Asian people there, Vietnamese, Chinese, but you do not talk much about the Asian flavor of the area. Has it changed?
Well, so I do talk about it a little bit when I'm describing the way that the neighborhood, sort of going through the neighborhood. The fact is that, so the 13th is pretty large arrondissement, and this area that used to be called Chinatown and is now often referred to as the Asian Quarter is maybe a quarter or something of the 13th. So where I live is really about 3 blocks from the edge of it, and I go there for shopping and many fine restaurants. And there are ways in which a couple of the stories intersect with it. And I would say the Asian Quarter has changed over time some, in that it no longer has such strict boundaries. I think this is true in many of the more kind of ethnic quarters in Paris, that there used to be pretty strict understandings of where a population was kind of expected to stay or something. And now that's, I think, in a very useful way, in a fruitful way, is kind of blurring. But there is still quite a concentration. But there are lots of sort of traditional Franco-French people who are living in that area too. So there's mix in both directions.
That's interesting. Well, that will be for the second volume. And I think the last question is a really good one. This is from Julie Farrar. What was the moment you felt French, i.e. that you belonged?
Yeah, right.
Did you ever feel that?
I think the times that I feel, I guess, I would say those are two slightly different questions. One feels like French, and one feels like one belongs. But my feeling of belonging, again, has to do with people. So it is almost never just like wandering through the streets and feeling that I'm somehow at one with the city. But it has to do with events with friends that I've developed, and sort of adventures that I have. I've got, so my friend Guy, so Sabine's husband, he and I make regular trips. He's from Burgundy, and we make regular trips to Burgundy to go stopping at particular wineries where he has sort of like connections, and we taste things and we buy things and we bring things back and we stop for lunch. And it's just like a wonderful, friendly outing. But it also feels so tied to the countryside, and tied to a way of life, and tied to so many other things. Those are the kinds of things where I feel like, oh, this is, somehow magically a kind of belonging.
Do you miss it like crazy now? Are you longing for?
Yeah. I've not been to Paris since December. This is the longest stretch of time I have spent in this country in literally decades.
I hope you're at least renting out the apartment. And
yeah, I've a friend watching over it. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, that's very gentle of you. Yeah, that's good. Any other questions that we didn't get to? David Leibovitz, Proficiency. Oh, well, I'll just ask this since it's only fair. When did you start learning French, and when did you know that teaching French would be your career? It's a good one, actually.
Yeah, right. So I started learning French in the 5th grade, And it was, again, as I mentioned, it was just like forced upon me. I had no choice in this. My parents were always putting me in schools for some reason where French was being taught. And then I did live, even though like Minnesota born and bred and everything, lived in the UK for a few years. And so if you're going to school in the UK, the big language is French, and then you get like shuttled over for school trips and things like that. I have to say, I hated it. And when I finished high school, I thought, thank God, I'm now in control of my own life. I will never, ever take another French class again. And I went to college starting to do other languages, and made the mistake one day of saying, well, I'm going to do just one more French class. And that was sort of the beginning of the end. I don't think I was thinking at that point what I would do with it, that I would ever teach it. It was just following my interests. And I think that, for better or worse, is the way that I made my way through my entire time at college, just following my interests, following my nose, and then afterwards thinking, now what can I do with this? And it turned out I could teach.
And write.
Yeah, and write.
And
Yeah.
write. So great. I think we'll grab Allison again, and I just want to remind everyone to buy the book and buy several copies of it. It's not like any France book you've ever read, and I think that's a really good thing. So enjoy, and thank you so much. Good luck with the rest of the tour.
Well, thank you so much, Marsha. That was a really great conversation. And I feel as if we have I think we do have Allison.
Yeah.
There we go. I
Yes.
was having some trouble getting my screen to pick on up. Thank you both so much. This has been such a wonderful event. It was so great to hear you both talk about France. I hope to one day make it there once all this craziness is over.
Oh my gosh, you have to.
I was gonna say, you've definitely piqued my interest and made me go like, okay, yeah, no, it's definitely happening.
Good.
All right, everyone. Well, do not forget to hit the green button below in order to purchase your copy of this incredible book. We will have signed book plates available for these as well. So if you order online, you'll be able to get a signed copy. We hope to see you here again for one of our other amazing virtual events. This month, we are celebrating everyone going back to school with our Get Schooled series, which features middle grade and YA authors. On August 17th, we'll be discussing diversity in middle grade. And then on the 19th, we'll be discussing mental health, which is such an important topic. This is also National Romance Month, and we have a collection of events that are about romance that will be happening later on in the month. So make sure to check out the link that is posted in the chat. Also, we will be starting our new inclusive book club called Culture Exposure, where we're discussing books written by authors representing a wide range of marginalized communities. Our first one is August 26th at 7 p.m. and features the short story collection Octavia's Brood, Short Stories for Social Justice. So we have a lot of really amazing, cool things happening at Barbara's. So please keep your eye out for us. Please make sure to check out all of our events and our website and get your hands on this amazing book. Thank you all so much, and we will see you again soon. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.